I'm going to be discussing the New York Times Company versus the United States court case, which took place in 1971, and it mainly dealt with the question of prior restraint involving freedom of the press. So for the background, papers that became known as the Pentagon Papers, or History of U.S. Decision-Making Process of Vietnam Policy, were illegally obtained and then sent to a couple different newspapers. This was at a time when Americans were divided on the U.S. involvement in the war, so keeping these secret Department of Defense studies out of the public eye at this time was important to the government. After being sent these papers, the New York Times published part of them. Then, acting at the government's request, the U.S. District Court in New York issued a temporary injunction or a court order that directed the Times not to publish the documents. So now that the Times couldn't publish these papers, the original source leaked them to the Washington Post. However, this time the courts didn't allow the government a second injunction. And this is Daniel Ellsberg, the person responsible for copying and leaking the Pentagon Papers. He is a former U.S. Marine and military analyst who had worked on this study, but then came to oppose the war. This case was rushed through courts because of the unique national importance and attention. It took only 2 weeks after the Times published the first set of articles for the Supreme Court to hear the arguments, and then only 5 days later they made their decision. This is a picture of Richard Nixon, who was president during this time. Nixon didn't believe that the First Amendment is absolute. He said that freedom of the press doesn't apply when the nation's security is at risk. So the constitutional issues involved with this case lead to these two questions. Are freedoms of the First Amendment absolute, and did the threat to national security outweigh freedom of the press? Then decision and rationale. It was a 6-3 decision made in favor of the New York Times. The court showed that it wouldn't stifle the press on order of the government, and this case also reinforced the idea of prior restraint. Although 6 judges did vote in favor with the New York Times, only 2 of them were strong in their belief that freedom of the press is absolute, or in other words, that it can't be stopped. And coming up, these are pictures of the 2 judges who believed that freedom of the press is absolute. On the top right corner is Justice Hugo Black, and on the bottom left corner is William Douglas. So more judge opinions. The other 4 judges that sided with the New York Times said that prior restraint is possible when the nation and American lives are at immediate risk. And one of these 4 judges said that the papers should have been held until the court had adequate time to carefully evaluate. And some also personally thought that the Times went too far, but nothing in the law could prevent them from publishing. Outcome. This was a major win for the newspaper, even though they didn't publish the most sensitive part of the papers that the government warned them about. However, the papers still eroded the American public's confidence in their nation's Cold War foreign policy. And the Supreme Court, although it sided with the New York Times, failed to specify exactly when prior restraint on the press, if at all, is constitutional. The First Amendment states that no federal law can be made abridging the freedom of the press, but some cases in the 20th century established precedents, creating exceptions, and the most recent was the grave and probable rule, which was in Dennis versus the U.S. And during this case, the wording was changed to grave and irreparable danger standard, and the idea behind the numerous versions of the rule is that if a certain message will likely cause a grave and irreparable danger to the public, then the message's prior restraint could be considered acceptable. And at the top right is the Pentagon Papers, which were the ones illegally obtained and then published. And the picture in the bottom left is of the New York Times discussing the Supreme Court case.
Okay. All right.